You ever had problems in your photographs where the highlight areas are all blasted out and there's no detail, and the shadow areas are all blocked up and there's no detail? Well, that's a problem with dynamic range, and we're going to talk about that in this video, plus the use of histograms and other tools to deal with it. So check it out. Hi, Peter Charles here of Hooked for Life Photography, and today we're going to take a look at dynamic range and histograms. Now, simply put, dynamic range is the range or the ratio or in stops between the darkest area of a picture where we can see detail and the lightest area of a picture and we can still see detail. The way to visualize it, for example, let's say we had a wooden wall that we've painted matte black, and in front of it we had a fresh fall of white powdery snow. So good dynamic range, we would still be able to see the detail in the wood grain of the wall, and we would still see the texture in the white powder snow. So that's ideal when you can see both the dark and the light. Now, the histogram in our cameras is basically a picture of dynamic range. So in other words, we visually see how the camera is perceiving a dynamic range. And that's important because our eyes generally have more dynamic range than the camera. So we tend to see more detail than the camera can see. So we have to expose properly to ensure that we're going to get the right exposure for our cameras. So let's start by taking a look at histograms and the effects of dynamic range on the camera and on the photos. I've got a black card in front of me, and I have focused on the middle of it, and you can see it's a little bright on one side and a little dark on the other. And what we're going to do is we're going to change my exposure here. And you can see the histogram on the bottom right. That little white double peaked mountain it looks like. What it's doing is it's showing us where our exposure fits in that dynamic range. If I go all to the left, let me darken this up, and I go all to the left, you can see it's disappearing off to the left. And you can see the image is totally black. There's no detail. And what that has told you is when you've gone all the way to the left, there's no detail left in the black. It's just straight black. You cannot see any detail at all in it. So if I go the other way and I start lightening this up, you can see the histogram starts to move into the middle. And once I'm clear of the edge, right there, I'm still on the edge there. I've just cleared the edge. Once I've cleared the edge with the histogram, what that is saying is now I have detail in all of my shadow areas. So my shadow areas can be seen. You don't have to pull anything out in your editing software. You can see it without you having to do anything. And if I keep going, you can see as it lightens, the histogram is moving into the center. So what we're getting now is, you see my card has gone gray. Well, that is what your meter of 18% reflectance, that's what your meter reads, what is the average you're trying to achieve. So you can see the histogram is right in the middle of the range. It's telling your exposures in the middle. And for a lot of average scenes, typical scenes where everything's well lit, if you look at your histogram, that's what you're going to see if you're properly exposed to that scene. And that's your average exposure right there. Now, if we keep on going, I'm going to have to up my ISO to keep going here. You can see my histogram is moving over to the right, is going off. And I'm going to stop there for a moment. Look at the right side of that card. It's completely blasted out. There's no detail. You see nothing. You still see detail to the left, but not to the right. And I'll just keep going. And now there's nothing left, and the card is completely white. Now, here's the difference between going completely white versus completely black. You're going on to the black side. There's still maybe some detail buried in there that you might be able to pull out. But when you clip, what's called clipping, when you go completely to the right, and your histogram has gone off the chart off to the right, there is no detail. There is no data. It's called clipping. There is literally no data in the signal. So when you try to work with that, you get into your editing software and you try to find some detail in there, there's none, because there's no data. So while there might still be a bit of data buried in the shadows, there's no data buried in the highlights because it's clipped, it's gone, it's literally recorded nothing. So what we need to do in this case is called exposing for the highlights, basically. What we're going to do is, keep that histogram as close to the right side without clipping anything. You see here it's starting to clip. So step it down 1/3 of a stop. Now you look on that card on the right side, it's very bright, but you can still see some detail. As soon as I go 1/3 of a stop more, we're starting to lose detail because it's starting to clip. So, that would be up to you where you want to put that exposure. But what we're doing at that point is exposing for the highlights to try and get the highlights. And now that's on a black card. What happens if we got a range between black and white? Let's see what happens. So I'm going to move my card. There we go. So I've exposed a white card underneath. And you can see I've got plenty of tonality in the black card. We can see lots of detail. But look onto the right side of the histogram. It's gone. The white card has no detail at all. It's completely gone, completely clipped. So if I was exposing for the scene, I had an overcast sky, dark trees, I would drop my exposure down until I can actually get detail in the bright sky. Now you'll notice that the black has gone off the chart to a certain extent. There's still some there. That is where we'd say expose for the highlights. If this was an overcast sky, I would see detail in the clouds at this point. You know how it is on overcast days, you still see some texture in the clouds. You would see that texture at this point. But shadow areas might be blocked up, but we can probably pull that out in editing software without getting into a lot of noise. So you can see this is beyond, this black card and white card is beyond the range, the dynamic range of this camera. This camera cannot get both the black and the white, so they're both on the graph. If I start pulling the white, see the black is still blocked up. I go a little bit further. Now the black is starting to come into where I'm getting all the detail in the black. We can see detail in the card, but now the whites are clipping. So see, the white is clipped. So I have to make a choice. This black and white card situation is exceeding its ability to give me both detail in the highlights and detail in the shadows. So I have to sacrifice something. So normally what I would want to do is expose. So I have my highlights, which is about I could probably get about there, which is that 1/3 of a stop. I'd have most of my highlights. I might lose a little bit. And I still have some detail in the black. You can see in the black card, you can still see some detail in it. And the rest of that detail I'll probably be able to pull out with my editing software. Especially if you're shooting RAW. This is one of the, we can talk about RAW in another video. But one of the good reasons for shooting RAW over shooting in JPEG is that you have more detail in the shadows to work with when you're shooting in RAW. If we have a photo that's too dark like this one, you'd be surprised how much detail can be pulled out of the shadows. Now I'm using a RAW image here, which gives me more latitude than a JPEG image might. So let's take a look at how much I can pull out. First off, let's take a look at the histogram here, and you can see it's all the way off to the left. And we would expect that, considering all these trees and leaves are all black. There's no detail here. There's no detail in the tree trunk. So let's see what we can pull out. I'm going to turn on shadows and highlights, and I'm just going to start pulling this shadow slider, and you can see how much detail I'm pulling out of those black areas of the photo. Now, the noise level's also building up, so you don't get something without paying a penalty for it. But you can see I can keep pulling and get almost to the point where it's a little bit too bright. And you can see all of the detail that's in those shadow areas. But if you look here, you can really see the noise. So all through here, this has become a very noisy photo because I have pushed it to the limit in trying to get the detail out of the shadows. If you look at the histogram at the top, you can see it moving as I am moving the slider. I just want to get some separation here. You can see this black bit. It tells me that my waveform is no longer blocked up to the left. So this might be the best compromise, somewhere in that ballpark. You might bring it back a little bit more. As long as I've got a gap there, it tells me there's still some detail to be seen. And you can see detail through the jacket. You can see detail here in the tree trunk and in the leaves. So that's a good example of how, using editing software, we can get detail out of the shadow areas that really are so blocked up, they just look solid black. The other thing you can do with cameras is this camera has the ability to increase dynamic range. It's not foolproof. It gives you a little bit of extra, and I'll show it to you here. So there it is, dynamic range at 100. You can set it to auto, 400. Now, something you'll be aware of is you have to have your ISO high enough for this to work. In this case, the base ISO of this camera is 160. So at a minimum, I need 640 for this to work. And I can use 400, which is 400% basically. So I've gone up 2 stops. So going up to 200% increases it by 1 stop. Going up to 400 increases it by 2 stops. But in this case, I have to have my ISO at a minimum of 640 for us to have the range, because what it's doing with this is it's bringing down the highlights by essentially decreasing the ISO for the highlight areas or increasing the ISO for the shadow areas. So that's where you're getting that yin and yang going on, as when you increase the dynamic range, it's playing with the ISO, applying more ISO or less ISO to parts of the scene to try and recover what otherwise would be lost detail. So that's essentially what's going on if you have the ability to adjust dynamic range on your camera. The penalty for that, you have to be working at a base ISO that here, which in my case is 640. So you wouldn't be using anything lower than that, because I'll show you what happens. If I set this down to, say, 200, and I'll bring my exposure back up, and I hit the Q menu, you can see it's grayed out, and I can put it to 100 and auto, but that's it. I don't have 200, I don't have 400. That's because my ISO is too low. So I would have to bring my ISO up to 640 in order for me to have 200 and 400 available. So that's the only trick. The downside to doing it is you have to have a high ISO. And I find, from practical standpoint, you get a bit of benefit out of it. You don't get tons of benefit out of it. So don't look at that as being some magic fix that's going to give you an automatically great two extra stops. It gives you some benefit. So all in all, though, I think it's something to keep in mind. If you've got that ability in your camera and you're dealing with a high contrast scene, it's better to turn it on. And I've got my dynamic range now at 400. And, you know, I can get a little bit more out of this. About there, I've got some detail in the white and some detail in the black. So I've gained a bit. So histograms are good for judging where your exposure should be, if you want an average exposure. They're also very good for watching out for clipping, and also watching out for blocking up of your shadow areas. So you can turn this on and off in your camera, histograms. I'm sure most cameras have the ability to turn on the histogram so you can see it. So if you are, this is very handy when you're sitting on a tripod and you're dealing with a high contrast scene and you're a little concerned that you may be losing the highlights, just turn on your histogram and check it. And if you see it going, the waveform is going completely off to the right, you know that you're not going to be able to recover those highlight areas. So if you're looking at white fluffy clouds, you might lose some of those clouds. And you have to bring your exposure back, bring the waveform so it's fully into the graphing area of the histogram. And then you will have all your highlights captured. And then if you've lost anything at the other side, toward the shadow end, pull it back with your editing software. So that's dynamic range and histograms, and simplified. And if you pay attention to your histogram, you won't get the surprises that I had when I started shooting transparencies in lovely forest settings with sunlight coming through, and my highlights would be blasted out and I wouldn't figure out what's going on. Now we have the ability to see what's going on with our histograms. So don't be afraid of them. Use them. Cheers.